Thank you so much for coming to this afternoon's event with Adelle Waldman. I'm Mark Koplik of the New York State Writers Institute. We are so grateful for the students in classes who follow our schedule and for the faculty who teach the great books that we celebrate. We have so many more events ahead of us this season. I won't mention any of them. Please visit our website or pick up a brochure if you'd like to know more about upcoming events. Books are available for sale and can be signed after the event, and you'll get a chance to meet our author. After a conversation with Adelle, we'll be taking your questions. We love, indeed we treasure your questions. If you have a question that you didn't get to ask, you can do so on the signing line. You do not need to buy a book to join the signing line. We are so grateful to have Karin-Lin Greenberg here with us today to guest moderate this event and to introduce Adelle Waldman. Karin was featured in our series back in February with her beautiful debut novel, You Are Here, which presents the residents of a small upstate New York town who must grapple with the impending closure of a once bustling shopping mall. We couldn't imagine a better person than Karin to have a conversation with Adelle, whose new novel is about the lives and economic hardships of retail workers at a big box store in upstate New York. Both bring us tales of the retail apocalypse that impacts so many people, powerless people, right here in our own community. Karin's novel, inspired by malls in our own neighborhood, appeared on numerous best of lists throughout 2023, including Elle magazine's Best and Most Anticipated Books of 2023, Washington Post 10 Noteworthy Books for May, and Oprah Daily's Best Books You Might Have Missed in 2023. Lynn Greenberg's 2013 short story collection, Faulty Predictions, won the Flannery O'Connor Award in short fiction. She's Associate Professor of English at Siena College. Please give a warm welcome to Karin-Lin Greenberg.
Everyone, so thank you for coming out in the rain today. So I'm delighted to have the chance to both introduce Adelle Waldman and to also speak to her about her new novel, Help Wanted, which I absolutely loved. I'm going to keep this introduction pretty brief, so we'll have more time to talk about this wonderful novel, and then also leave some time for questions from all of you. Adelle Waldman's first novel is The Love Affairs of Nathaniel P., which was named one of 2013's best books by The New Yorker, The Economist, The New Republic, NPR, Slate, Book Forum, The Guardian, and others. Her second novel, Help Wanted, which we're going to talk about today, was published this past March by Norton and has been widely praised. And many of you probably saw the exciting news that it was on Barack Obama's recommended books for summer 2024. And among other honors, it was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, an Economist, Vogue, and Vulture Best Book of the Year, and People's Book of the Week. And Waldman's writing has also appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Book Review, The Wall Street Journal, Slate, and other publications. So just very briefly, Mark already mentioned a few things about this book, and we'll get into a lot more, but Help Wanted is the story of Team Movement, who work in store number 1512 of the big box store Town Square, located in the upstate New York town of Potterstown in the shadow of the Catskill Mountains. This group of characters unloads trucks, sorts boxes, and stocks the stores in the middle of the night. The novel depicts a bustling, hidden world that only exists during the hours before the sun rises. The characters are the invisible people that make Town Square run. And for me, reading this novel made me think so much about all the work that's accomplished by the people in our society we seldom see and unfortunately seldom notice. Waldman paints the complicated and difficult histories of these characters and lets readers fully understand what brought them to their jobs at Town Square. This is a book about a store on the surface, but ultimately it's about the people who work there and their hopes and dreams and desires. In The Guardian, Kevin Power describes this novel as deeply humane, and I could not agree more. So please join me in welcoming Adelle Waldman, who's going to read just a little bit from the novel to start us out.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Karen. That was lovely, and thank you, Mark, for having me here, and also for such a great pairing. I was saying to Karen, you never know who you're going to be paired with for these kinds of conversations, but Karen wrote an amazing novel that is about, I think as Mark said, about a mall upstate, and I couldn't imagine a better pairing, so I'm thrilled to be here and to be speaking with Karen today, and to all of you. So I'll keep it brief. I'm just going to read a tiny bit to give a sense of the tone of the book, which in spite of what I hope in some ways is serious subject matter, there's a lot of economic exploitation that's discussed in this book. The characters are maybe not particularly well treated economically by their employer or by society, but I hope there's also an ironic, somewhat comic tone. So I'm just going to read from the first page to just give a brief sense. It's the beginning of the shift where the group of workers, they're getting ready. But actually, I don't even need to say that because it's in the first paragraph. The first hint something was up was so subtle that it barely registered. Just before the start of Monday's 4 a.m. shift, the members of Movement were in the employee area at the front of the store, waiting to clock in. Everyone was there. Everyone, that is, except Meredith, the person at the center of the plot that was soon to take shape, its reason for being. Nicole turned to Little Will, Movement's group manager. "She's still coming back today," Nicole asked. "She hasn't been, fired." At 23, Nicole was the youngest person in Movement. "Nope," answered Little Will. "She texted me last night." As if Nicole had demanded proof, he fished his phone from his pocket, tapped its screen several times, and passed the device to her. "I'll be a little late tomorrow," read the message from Meredith, boss. "I need a little rest after vacay. You know how it is." The words were followed by 2 emojis, a beach ball and a glass of wine. Nicole rolled her eyes. She was about to hand back Little Will's phone when a new text bubble appeared on the screen. She couldn't help but read it. "Hey man, I've got some news. Could be big for Movement. Coming in now. We'll tell you and M after the unload." The text was from Big Will, the store manager. "Huh," Nicole said. She gave the phone back to Little Will, then watched him as he read the text. Little Will was 6'1". He was only called Little Will to distinguish him from Big Will. Big Will was 5'11", but it was his grinning face captured by a Polaroid that sat at the top of the org chart taped to the wall of the break room at Town Square store number 1512 in Potterstown, New York. "Maybe Meredith really is getting fired," Nicole said when Little Will looked up from his phone. She grinned hopefully. Nicole was pretty and a fresh-faced, apple-cheeked, straight from the farm way, the kind of dimpled white girl you could picture in ye olden days in a gingham dress and braids as she milked a cow. To tamp down such associations, she slouched, wore baggy t-shirts and boxy pants that sat low on her hips, smoked constantly, avoided both the sun and foods that weren't heavily processed and or white in color, and generally cultivated an air of boredom and free-floating hostility. Little Will frowned. As a manager, albeit a low-level one, he tried to adhere to certain standards. Nicole looked at him with something close to pity. It wasn't only because he was too nice to talk shit, even about Meredith. He'd missed multiple buttons on his shirt, a limp, faded, pill-covered flannel he kept balled up on the passenger seat of his car when he wasn't working. Swatches of white undershirt were visible between buttonholes. Little Will would have been ridiculous if he weren't so good-looking. The digits on the 2 identical time clocks hanging on the opposite wall changed synchronously from 3:54 to 3:55. The text slipped from Nicole's mind as she joined the others to clock in. And I'm going to leave it there for the beginning of the shift. Kind of a cliffhanger. Thank you.
No, you can have a seat. Okay, bring it over. Okay. Doing this two-handed is not always working. Sorry. Okay. You're all set. Okay. There you go.
Thank you.
I'm going to pin this to your jacket.
Okay.
Here.
Thank you.
Sorry, this is ripped on your foot. Now we're good.
Awesome.
All right. So, okay. It's working. Thank you.
It's always a little bit of a surprise when it works, right?
Thanks, Jen. So thank you so much for that reading. Before we start talking about the book, I know we have a lot of students in the audience, and I think many are, I know, readers, and I think probably some also are interested in becoming writers. And so I was wondering if you could just start with just talking a little bit about your own journey as a writer. Was this something you studied in school? And then kind of leading up to the writing of this particular book. It's your second novel, but just kind of your history as a writer.
Sure. Okay, I'll try to keep it brief. Sometimes it's hard for me. So I didn't study creative writing or even English in college for some odd reason. I studied history, and I guess I do get the reason. I loved history, and I found it very interesting. I learned a lot. And then I got in my head that I would like to be a newspaper reporter or journalist in my 20s because I wanted to write a novel, but I didn't think I was ready. I didn't feel like I had enough to say. I feel like I could write maybe an autobiographical novel about my experiences as a very young person, but it wasn't quite the novel I wanted to write. So I was like, all right, I need to amass some life experience. And this might not be that useful to people today, but back at the time, because this was the late 90s, one could actually become a newspaper reporter. There were, it's sad to say, thriving local newspapers, and they were eager to hire recent college grads who were willing to work for very low pay and work odd hours and just cover fires in the middle of the night. I think it's really unfortunate that we have so little of that around today. But I did that for several years, and I thought it was a great experience because you learn about the world, you talk to people, and there's writing involved. You're writing sentences and making deadlines. You know, it's not novel writing, but it was writing. And then I just tried to read a lot of fiction at night and read serious fiction, ambitious fiction, and write at night. For reasons that are sometimes hard for me to explain even to myself. I didn't get an MFA, even though at a certain point in my 20s, I got very lonely for companionship as a fiction writer, and I sort of encourage other people who might be in a similar boat to consider MFA programs if they can make it work financially, just for companionship, because I think I suffered needlessly from sort of kind of doing this on my own. But when I was 29, I finally wrote my first novel. After years of trying, I'd start something, I'd throw it out after 30 pages, 50 pages. So I was 29, and I wrote this novel. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It had characters. It had a plot. I couldn't believe it. I was so excited when I finished it. I thought that like within months I'd be on Fresh Air with Terry Gross. I'd be rich and famous. I'd never have to work again. And I think I confused the euphoria of finishing a novel with, you know, a reasonable assessment of its quality and prospects in the world. It turned out that novel did not get published. I was able to find an agent for it eventually, but the agent was pretty young and inexperienced. It might have said something that all the other literary agents who were more experienced turned it down. The whole process took about a year because then the agent sent it to publishers, but they took their time with it because the agent wasn't so powerful that she couldn't be like, read it in a week. So it took a year for me to accept that it was not going to be published. And that turned out to be, perversely, it was a very painful experience, but it was a turning point for me because I realized that I'd learned two things that I hadn't known before. One was that I could write a novel with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and the other was that I actually really liked doing it. So I decided to do it again, and at this point, I skipped this part. I kind of stopped being a journalist at this point and became an SAT tutor. That was because I thought I'd only be doing it for a couple months before I was rich and famous from novel writing. And I was like, you know, journalism is really hard work. It's like low paying. I could do this part-time. I'll make more money. I was an SAT tutor for the next 6 years. You know, I thought it would be 3 months, but 6 years. So I spent the next few years working on my next novel, The Love Affairs of Nathaniel P., which then did find an agent and did get published. So I guess I would say for me, there's just a lot of perseverance, and you know, it's easy when you talk about this in retrospect to make light of how I felt when the first novel didn't get published, but of course it was devastating at the time. I think one of the things I've tried to take from the experience is like, what can we learn from rejection? And you know, it's so miserable, it doesn't make it easier in the moment, but you know, for me, I really did learn I can do this and I want to do it again. Yeah, I think that's probably covers.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you, especially for sharing about that first novel that, didn't get published. Because I think oftentimes, we look at a beautiful finished product like this and we don't hear about the things that lead up to it and what's behind it.
Right, I agree. I find that frustrating sometimes, because I think as a young person starting out, or as anyone, mid-career, I think no one becomes a writer and doesn't face rejection. And I think it's important that we talk about that, because I think being able to handle rejection, to get through it without either getting so depressed that you give up or getting so angry that you also give up because you're just so angry at the industry, can be really important.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that's why it's good to come to events like this, because you hear this, and I think you just, you read the bio in the back, and you read the successes, and you don't hear about what led to them. So thank you for the generosity of that answer. So I think you've been asked this question a whole lot, but you worked at a big box store for a while before you wrote this book. Could you just talk about that experience, and then also talk about just how it led to the writing of this book?
Right. So I worked at a big box store specifically with the idea of writing a novel. I didn't know that this novel would come from it. For me, what it was, my first published novel, The Love Affairs of Nathaniel P., couldn't be more different in its subject matter. It was about sort of privileged writer types in Brooklyn, sort of intellectuals and their love lives. And I say that I don't mean to disparage it. There's a lot that I value in it. But for me, what happened, I really believed in that book. I'm a lover of Jane Austen, a lot of 19th century novels. I don't think there's anything wrong with writing books about romance and courtship. And in a lot of ways, I intended that book to be in conversation with books by people like Philip Roth and Saul Bellow that are brilliant writers, but who aren't always, I think, fair to their women characters. So I say that I believe in the book. I'm not trying to disparage it, but that book came out in 2013, and for the next few years I was pretty busy. I got a lot of opportunities as a result to write some literary criticism, which I loved, and someone asked me to write a pilot for a television show based on Edith Wharton's House of Mirth, and I did that, and it was fun. It was great. Also, because Edith Wharton is so brilliant, basically all I had to do is just use her dialogue and just put it in screenplay mode. And then as a result, I had to join the Writers Guild, the union, in order to do this assignment and to sort of be part of the Screenwriters Union. And that gave my husband and my daughter and me health insurance for 2.5 years. That's much better than our Obamacare health insurance. So things were happening. It was great. But what I wasn't doing was writing another novel. I didn't feel that inspired. And then it was the year 2016. I don't know how significant that was for everyone here. My daughter was born that year. There was a presidential election. I found myself after that election being a little more concerned about politics and the political situation than I was about personal life. And I just felt like, as I thought about trying to write another novel, that I just couldn't get excited about another novel about personal life. And after a while, I got in my head, I was like, either I'm gonna have to stop being a novelist or find a different subject for a novel, and that seemed a little odd. But I thought of some books I loved, like Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dimed. I don't know who's read that book, but where she did several low-wage jobs and tried to live on her earnings and then recounted that experience. A book by the novelist Stuart Onan, Last Night at the Lobster, about people who work at a Red Lobster. I really enjoyed both those books. And I enjoyed some books about offices too. Joshua Ferris's Then We Came to the End. And I got this idea that maybe doing a novel, a workplace novel, would be a way to talk about some of the things I want to talk about. And so I had worked jobs that were similar to the retail job in this book before. When I was younger, I'd bagged groceries, I'd worked at Starbucks, I'd worked at bookstores, libraries, and mostly I'd been a waitress more than anything. But though that had been a long time ago by the time I sat down to write this, it was probably almost 20 years before. And I felt like if I was going to do what I wanted to do, I wanted it to have this like fine-grained texture that Last Night the Lobster and Nickel and Dime has. And I felt like I've got to get a job now and pay attention. So I went up and down the strip where all the retail stores are near where I live, and I guess not just retail. I applied to Starbucks, but they didn't rehire me. I feel like they might have had me on the record from I'd quit 20 years earlier after my store got held up, and I was at the register and I got held up, and then what annoyed me, it wasn't even that bad, it wasn't scary, but then the police came to do a report, but I was the only one working, so my manager was like, you keep working, I'll tell them what happened. I was like, what? Anyway, and then that annoyed me, so I quit. And anyway, Starbucks did not rehire me 20 years later, but I got a job at a big box store. And it turned out to be, I don't want to say everything I could have wanted and more. I do want to say that, but that's also, it seems like a tasteless way to say it, because what it was a mix of, I worked with amazing people I loved who just were brilliant and funny, and I tried to capture some of that in the book. The jokes were so good. We had so much fun. But what was also incredibly upsetting was the degree to which there were just so few opportunities for advancement, and my coworkers and I were paid so little. Raises were like, they shouldn't even be called raises. They were barely cost of living increases, but they were doled out with this like fanfare as if they were great raises. Like, here, enjoy your extra 3 cents per hour. That's going to amount to a whole, like 72 cents extra a week. And one of the worst things was that all of us were part-time workers, and the only jobs available for people who weren't managers were part-time jobs, and my coworkers just struggled to get enough hours, and often just never did get enough hours to get by. So I really wanted to write a book that kind of captured this duality between people who were fun and cool and made the best of it and had this like very vibrant world, and then this degree of an impossible situation where people were walking to work through rain and snow because they couldn't afford cars. There's a lot of food insecurity, and these were people who worked so hard and were so good at their jobs and like always signed up for any extra hours they could get. And it's just an impossible situation.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the novel does such a great job of showing that these are characters who, want the best for their families, are working really hard, and it's this system that just always gets in their way. And yeah.
Right. And I think that it can be easy for people who don't have firsthand experience in this world to imagine, like there's a lot of comforting beliefs we might have, which is that if people work hard and are reliable, then there's opportunities for advancement, and that's just how the world works. And you want to think, okay, if people are stuck in jobs like that, it's, then maybe there's issues, there's mental illness or drug addiction, and that's sad, but is it really the fault of their employer? I think, having talked to a lot of people about this book, I think that's what people who don't have firsthand experience with this world want to think. But it's just, for those who do have experience, we know that's just not the case. And I think the way the world is structured increasingly, with so much, in so many places, that the only jobs available are these kinds of low-paid service jobs, where the companies have done a very, very good job of cutting labor costs, and they do that by reducing management positions, making jobs part-time. Like, they cut costs, and it's great for consumers, but the way they do that is by reducing opportunity and making it impossible for their employees to live decently.
Yeah, so I really admired how this novel talked about work, and I'm really interested in work in fiction. I teach creative writing, and oftentimes, especially beginning students will have stories where nobody has a job, and I'm like, how did this character get that Mercedes? I was thinking about that too, where a new girl shows up here and she has a nice car, and everyone's kind of like, how did she have that car, right? And I think work characterizes and showing, we spend so much of our time at work. And so I was just like really interested in what you were thinking about just work and the characters, and how things are just tied together in terms of characterization and jobs.
Right. I mean, I feel like it's really challenging to write a novel that is about work just because there are fewer models for how to do it. Or one of the things I ran into is when I decided I wanted to write a book set in the store, and I should say when I first got the job, I didn't know for sure that this book would result. I thought I'd just see what happened. Maybe I would have met someone at the store, like a coworker, who had this crazy life story, and they'd give me permission to fictionalize it. I didn't know how it would go, but I quickly found, no. I want to write a book set in a store like this and really capture this reality. And one of the first challenges I had is that so many novels, like a novel needs a plot, right? You can't just have a setting and characters. You need something to happen. And so I went to my go-to plots. It was like, okay, a romantic triangle, or maybe there'd be like a really bad boss. In this book, there's annoying bosses, but there's no one evil. But maybe there could be a really bad boss who'd like sexually harass someone or something, and that would create some drama. But I felt like in each of those cases, that plot was taking me farther away from what interested me, not closer. Like what interested me was the camaraderie between the coworkers and the sort of subtle but ongoing and perpetual and very, very real and very painful economic exploitation. And I felt like doing these plots that would be about personal life or ratcheted up with this like almost cartoonishly evil boss. I mean, I shouldn't say cartoonishly evil because there are very bad bosses who sexually harass and do things to people, but it would sort of take away from the subtle everyday things I was most interested in. So it was like, how am I going to do this book that I want to just be about the life of the store? And what happened, it took me about a year. Honestly, I kept writing pages of like scenes from the big box store, and I'd send them to my agent. She's like, it's kind of boring. What's the plot? And I nearly gave up. And I was talking to my husband in the kitchen one day, and he was like, you'd mentioned a succession plot of like who would get promoted. And I was like, yeah, but I can't do it because for this reason and that reason. But then a light bulb went off, and I just got this idea for what is ultimately the plot of this book, where it's about a group of characters, and they have an annoying boss, and who's their like immediate boss. But then the store manager, the highest honcho at the store, turns out to be leaving, and the workers get this idea that if they tried to make their annoying, incompetent boss look brilliant, she could get promoted to the head job, and then she would be off their backs, and then maybe one of them could get a lower level management job. And I just immediately liked it for so many reasons, because it was a way to dramatize the workplace experience and what I wanted to really capture, which was how few opportunities there were. So it's like how desperate people were. And then it was also a way to keep the focus on work and to keep the focus on the group. And like if you had a love triangle, you necessarily focus on 3, and I wanted to focus on the whole group. And then I also liked that it added some levity, because it was really important to me to capture that the workers are like, they're not people who their primary characteristic is poor person. They're people, they're funny, they are diabolical and capable of scheming, and they have a sense of humor. And I felt like just having a plot that's kind of inherently comic, I think imbued them with some humanity that was like, they are being exploited by their employer, but that's not all they are victims of exploitation.
Yeah, no, I thought that plot was so interesting. I think sort of in the simplest terms that I think about plot is, wanting to know what happens next.
Right.
And I was like flipping through these pages and thinking like, who is going to get that promotion? Who's going to get that job? So I thought it was such a nice way to frame the book.
Oh, I'm so glad. I know I love it when a few people have actually compared to Succession, the TV show. I don't know how many people watch it, which I love, because there is a similarity in plot, and yet there couldn't be more of a dissimilarity in the lifestyles.
Something that I really admired about the book was point of view and how the reader has access to the thoughts of so many of these characters. So I was just curious, what you were thinking when you were figuring out this novel? Like, did you know immediately you wanted, is it like a dozen characters maybe whose minds you get into? Is that about?
Yeah, I think so.
Which is, I mean, that's so much to balance. And it's so interesting too, because it lets us know these things that are happening that the characters don't know. You know, like a handful of them want the same job, right?
Right.
And nobody, but I think some start to figure out that others maybe are looking at it too, but they don't all know. So it's such an interesting balance of so many characters. So I'm just curious, like how you figured out, you know, who you would spend time with in their minds, you know, why you chose so many point of view characters.
I love this question, especially coming from Karin, whose novel also has multiple points of view, and I think you also did that so well, and I really love that. So I think we have sort of a similarity in, or it'd be interesting to talk about underlying similarities and what we're trying to do and why we did that. For me, some of it is I read a lot of 19th century novels. I think I mentioned that, and I think 19th century novels, there tends to be a little bit more like of a willingness to do a roving point of view. You know, Jane Austen will go in and out of a very close third person to an omniscient third person. You know, sometimes she'll be opining, like, what's the famous first line of Pride and Prejudice? Like, every single man with a big fortune is in want of a wife. You know, it's very like omniscient narrator, but then there'll be sections that are very close third where you're in the heads of the characters. And I always just enjoy that. And sometimes I feel like literary fiction can be a little more formal. Like, okay, you have to choose your point of view, or you can have a roving point of view, but each chapter has to be consistently told. I think because I didn't get an MFA and because I read so much 19th century fiction, I felt a little freer to just go in and out of characters' heads as I thought it served the scene. Like if one person I thought had the most interesting thought in a particular scene, I'd go into their head. But I will say it's a mixed bag in that I think that there are moments where readers have legitimately become confused because I do switch point of views so abruptly. So as much as it served me to do it that way, I see I'm like, I get why maybe it's worth trying to be more formal and careful and stick to a more orderly system. I've definitely seen on Goodreads, people are like, I couldn't tell who was talking. And I'm so grateful to the audiobook narrator of this book, because I think that must have been hard to switch point of view all those times without warning. Just like, yeah, now we're going to this person's head, not that one.
I sort of feel like nothing good can come of reading Goodreads. Once you filter just by 5 stars, that's my advice.
That is great advice.
Otherwise,
I'm going to try that. I didn't even know you could filter.
That's no offense to anyone with Goodreads reviews, but I think I have time for another question or two, right? One of the things I loved in this book was when you revealed information about characters' past. And I think a lot of the characters who initially maybe seem kind of, you know, as you said, nobody's bad, right? But like Meredith is the character that is the boss that everyone's sort of annoyed by. And more than halfway through the book, we learn about her past. We learn that she had these dreams, that she went to fashion school, then she had this dream. Is that okay?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. But that she had this dream to be a singer. And nobody else really knows this. And so she became quite sympathetic. I think we learn, another character, was going to college and then broke up with the girlfriend who was giving him a ride. It's like something that simple. And then he just ended up dropping out because he couldn't get to school. All these interesting things are revealed in the book that I think for me changed what I thought about, my first impressions of the characters. I was just curious, how did you figure out, when to give that information, and did that come to you through the writing process, or did that, did you know?
Oh my gosh, it took years and years of revising and trial and error. For example, Meredith, the annoying boss's backstory, I used to have it basically in the first chapter, maybe it was chapter 2. It was just as soon as you meet Meredith, I had 3 long paragraphs of how she got there. And I don't know why. It's so obvious when I realize if I'm reading students' writing or reading other people's writing, you're like, you don't need to put all that backstory upon first, as soon as the character says hello. Give the reader time to get to know the person and become curious about them before you tell them. It's just like if you met someone in real life and they told you your life story before you'd even found out if you were interested in getting to know them, it would be annoying. And I couldn't see that. I feel like in my defense, there's just a lot of characters here and a lot to manage and a balance between plot and character. But I felt like it was, I had to sort of, like the book I think is organized a little bit like a caper with this, the group is all plotting and their scheme and then they have their sub-schemes to get themselves promoted into Meredith's position if it works. So I had to teach myself how to write a caper because my first novel was much more of a conventional single point of view, followed a relationship from start to finish. And then figure out how and where to put in the backstory in ways that I thought would come at moments when the reader felt curious and would enhance the story rather than just feel like a boring aside. And I don't know about anyone here, but for me, the only way to do that is just to revise, like trial and error. If I were smart enough to just conceive of everything in an outline in the beginning, my life would be so much better. But it's trial and error is all that works for me.
I loved it as a reader, and I felt like it paralleled what happens, like at work, in life, where you get to know somebody kind of on the surface, their actions, and then later on you find out more. So I thought it was fantastic.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, I did. I mean, I hoped for some of, like, to recreate some of the feeling of having coworkers. In some ways, because of this book, it wasn't going to have one protagonist that you're in the head of the whole time, and you get to know in that intimate way that one does with a novel with a solo protagonist. I thought if you're not going to do that, what else could you do? And I liked the idea of having a coworker type feel where you largely know your coworkers as coworkers, and you know them very intimately in that setting. Like, you know their habits, you know who. I had to cut this character, but I had a character who every day at break, she was of a religion so strict where she couldn't have caffeine. So every day in the morning, she'd bring her own mug to work, fill it with water, put it in the microwave for exactly 50 seconds, and drink hot water. I wound up having to cut her because my agent had her like too many characters. But just like little things like that you know about your coworkers. And then to recreate that excitement when we learn more about our coworkers, or like on a sitcom about work, those scenes like on Cheers when you suddenly go home and see like Cliff's house. Well, maybe I'm dating myself with Cheers. Probably a lot of you weren't born when Cheers was on, but it was a great show about people who hung out at a bar in Boston. But this idea of like that, to keep it mostly at work, and then I'd hope that when we get the backstory, it would feel sort of exciting and special.
Yeah, I think that worked really nicely. And then just to tie into what you just said about Cheers, one of the things I noticed was that this whole book, I think except for one scene in a steakhouse, takes place in the store. So I was curious about that decision, just to like not go home with the characters. And we get a lot of their lives from what they're thinking and what they're remembering. But was that a constraint you set for yourself?
It was, and some of it I think was set for me by certain other aspects. Like I felt conscious of, by the time I was writing this book, I was a pretty solidly middle-class person. I'm obviously a white woman. I was writing about a group of characters who are all different races, ages, ethnicities. They're gay characters, straight characters, immigrants, people who are born here. And I felt like I could write about the workplace, but I didn't feel like I wanted to pretend that I could write each of these characters' life story. That would have felt presumptuous on my part. And I felt like there's some reason to keep it at work, to keep it with what I knew, and not get too over my skis and be like, I know these characters better than they know themselves. Like I don't. It's just I wanted to be true to the workplace and to capture their lives, right? But I didn't feel qualified to do like the full in-depth, the novel of, say, Ruby or Nicole or Milo or any of them. I love all the characters except for Meredith, but I felt there were limits. So
I think that's such an interesting way to think about it. It makes perfect sense. Yeah. I know you all probably have some questions. I just have one more question that I just wanted to ask you about Potterstown. I love the description of it being the type of town, or the town where there's a coffee shop and an old bank and I think the organic bakery and the former shirt factory. And I was like, I know this town. I've been to this town many times, And very interestingly, right, it's this town where the people who are in it are struggling and there's not very many opportunities, and it's sort of seen as this little, summer place, this vacation place for people from the city. So, this is a story that's so rooted in setting and place, but not just the store, but the town. So I was curious if you could just talk a little bit more about the town and how it, plays a role in this book.
Right. I think in a lot of ways the town's very specific to this part of New York State that we're all familiar with, but I also think it's representative of just larger national trends of so many places that are hollowed out. This town is a little better off than other towns because it's close enough to the city that it does get these city people and have these city businesses. I'm not sure it does so much good for a lot of the residents, but I guess it does some good, I guess, or does something. But I think that it can be easy for some of the type of people who too often are the ones who write fiction to set fiction in places that are thriving. People who write fiction tend to be the ones who've gone to college, who are able to live in a different type of place. I don't know, I wanted to take it seriously and treat it as a place to live. One thing I felt like I learned from my coworkers were just kind of neighborhoods in town. And I guess I can say Potterstown is rough, like loosely based on Kingston. I would fictionalize certain elements of it. It's so nice to just change the name because then I could do what I wanted. If there really is no coffee shop called Needs with a K that's in a shirt factory, no one can fault me because I call it Potterstown, and Potterstown, New York doesn't exist. But there were just certain neighborhoods where my coworkers lived that me in my regular life, I just sort of would have passed by and not found that interesting. And through getting to know my coworkers and hanging out with them, I came to see them differently. This apartment complex was the site where a lot of retail workers lived because it was in walking distance from all the stores. It was the site of so much drama and romantic triangles. And I don't know, I wanted to, without kind of sugarcoating it, just take it seriously as this is a place where people live and work, and it's not just a place where sometimes I think the kind of people who often read and write novels just think of it as a place people just want to get out of and they just want to move from there to a bigger city. And not everyone does, some people that's home. And I don't know, so it's just important for me to treat it respectfully but fairly,
Thank you. So I'm sure many of you have questions, so I'm going to turn it over.
I'm going to borrow your mic.
Yeah.
Who has a question? Let's start with you.
Hello. So I have found typically in the media I consume that some of my most favorite stories are the one that have you can sort of tell that the author is guiding us to an ending. Whether they know the specific details of that ending or not, I wouldn't know, but you tend to feel throughout the story that there's a direction guiding you to some sort of conclusion, even if the world is continuing on after that conclusion, but the story's over. I was wondering your thoughts on how important you think it is when writing a story or a novel to have an ending in mind.
Oh, that's so interesting. I love craft questions. When I first came up with this plot, and it's a little bit confusing when I say that, the plot being the plot to get this bad boss Meredith promoted, I didn't immediately know how the plot would work, if they would succeed or not. But I knew if I sat with it for a little bit and started writing, I'd figure it out. And I did. It came to me, and I don't want to give it away, but I liked where it went. And it was important to me that I knew pretty early on where it was going, because what I was hoping for from the reader's point of view, is that when you find out what happens, that it would both come as a surprise to the reader in the moment, could be they might gasp, but it would also, in retrospect, seem like it should have been obvious all along. I guess that's my favorite kind of plot twist, where it's both narratively satisfying, but then doesn't feel like some artificial Duse Machina where it's just oh, and then an asteroid came and destroyed the whole store. And so once I knew where it was going to, I was very conscious about trying to set up clues, and sometimes maybe just because I'm a very slow writer and I revise a lot, and I don't know how many of you guys are working on fiction and to what extent you revise, but great thing about revising is once you know where the thing is going, you can put in these little clues and then try to kind of craft them just right so they're not going too far and tilting your hand and they don't feel artificially put in, but that you know as the writer, like this little detail that might like look really natural in place. Let's say that this character doesn't have his GED, for example, on page 72, is actually going to be highly relevant on page 261. And I feel like as a writer, that's very satisfying when you do that, and you're like, oh no, it's all set up in the book, but probably a reader reading it for the first time wouldn't notice. So yeah, I think that crafting a book so it kind of maximizes readerly pleasure to me is very important, especially when you're trying to write a book that's maybe about things that are not super fun and kind of don't lend themselves to fun, because I wanted to be so accurate with the economic exploitation element. It was sort of like, how do you write a book about such a boring topic and also try to make people want to read it and make it fun? So it's like, if I can craft the narrative in a way so there's surprises, that could be the fun, even if I don't want to sugarcoat the subject matter. That helps.
Is there another hand raise that I missed? Oh, sorry.
How do you make the plot points in your story flow naturally? Like, how do you get from like one point to another without feeling arbitrary?
Oh gosh. Again, I'd refer to trial and error, and especially, it's funny how in some ways this is my third book, because as I mentioned, this first one that didn't get published, my first published book was my second book, and I feel like with each one, you just have to learn it all over again. For me, the thing that helped me write the first unpublished novel was it was the first time I had a plot. Like in my 20s, when I would try to write fiction, what I would do is I'd be in a certain mood, maybe something would have just happened to me and I'd be trying to process it, and I'd sit down and start writing something autobiographical about what had just happened. And then it would peter out after 30 or 50 pages because I didn't know where it was going or the mood would end. What made all the difference was starting out with a plot and characters. But I also felt ridiculous when I tried to do that the first time. It was like, I don't know how to do this. And as much as I'd spent my 20s reading so many novels, on my first draft of that first novel, I remember like I spent like 20 pages, it seems, like having all the characters that were all getting together to talk about, they're all just getting together in the same room. I swear I spent so many pages just having them say hello to each other and how are you? And before I realized like, oh no, you can condense that. Readers will intuit that they greet each other. Just get them in the room together and have them start talking. But I feel like in some ways, we all start writing fiction because we have these big things we want to say, truths about our lives or about the lives of other people or about psychology or the human condition or society. And then like half the craft of fiction writing is like establishing that someone walks across the room and turns on the lights, just getting the technical logistics or getting from one plot point to another, as you say, which is like very few people I think start writing fiction because they feel like they're really good at getting people across rooms. So I think for me it was trial and error. I think sometimes probably doing fiction writing classes can be very helpful with that if you want to not do it in such a time-consuming way as I did.
Hi, were your coworkers aware that you were a writer, and would they recognize themselves in any of the characters after the book was published?
That is a great question. So my coworkers, when I applied for the jobs, what I told myself, and I did have this journalism background, but I didn't really have a template for doing quite this, of sort of an immersive experience, but one I knew I wasn't going to write about as a journalist. If I wrote about it, it would be as fiction. So I felt like I was making up my own rules, and my rule was I wasn't going to lie. So I filled out the job applications accurately. I was a little nervous about having to say I'd graduated from college, which is unusual for that type of position, but I said I was a sort of a new mom and I was looking for something part-time that I could do take care of my daughter, and still be around when my husband was at work. So that was all true. And there was no question on the job application for the previous books published. So I didn't have to omit anything there. So I went in thinking, I'm not going to lie, but I'm not going to volunteer this. But as I became close to my coworkers, I started to feel like I was, I felt like I needed to tell them. I felt like I was keeping something important from them. And it didn't take long for them to know something was a little different about me, even more than I realized. Like, for example, my car stood out more than I realized in the employee parking lot, which Karin had mentioned in regard to another character in the book, that I put that in there. And it's not like my car is not particularly fancy by my regular life standards. It's a 2014 Toyota Prius, but it's like, it has power windows, the AC works, it'll play podcasts from my phone. Whereas my coworkers, if they had cars, they tended to be beat up and, the AC didn't work, that type of thing. So other people noticed, and also we're coming into work at like 3:45 in the morning. There aren't that many cars in the parking lot, so people notice my car is a little nicer. And then I did this in 2018, and there were midterm elections, which I was very into. And I don't know about up here, but where I was in Kingston, that we were in a swing district. I really wanted our representative to not be reelected, and I brought in voter registration forms. And my friends just thought I was like a little dorky, that I was just like really into voting. But they liked it about me. They thought it was sweet and funny. And then it offered to give anyone who needed a ride to the polls a ride. But then I decided on the election, I would actually tell my core group of friends, because I'd wanted to tell some of them before, but I didn't want to tell just one and say don't tell other people. I felt like if I was going to tell one, it might get out there. And I didn't want to do that too soon, because I didn't want the managers to find out and get fired. I wanted to make sure I was kind of ready, that if I got fired, it wouldn't be the end of the world. So I waited, and on election day, I told my core group, anyone who voted, if they got their little I voted sticker, I would we'd go to a bar and I'd buy them a drink. And by this point, they definitely knew I had more money, because my coworkers were not going to bars, not even for happy hour, because it's just too expensive. So this was special, and the fact that I was going to buy them all a drink, they just knew something was up with me. But everyone was excited to do it, so we did, and we were at the bars. We're at the 99, where happy hour starts at 3 p.m., which is great. If you start your job at 4 a.m., you're definitely ready for happy hour at 3. So we got there, and I told them, and they're kind of shocked. Then one of them gets on his phone and Googles me and finds my first book, and he's like, holy shit, guys, she's not lying. She really is a writer. And then they were actually really supportive and kind of excited, because before that, I was friends with them, but you're not going to go around asking your coworkers things like, tell me about your childhood. But then all of a sudden, they wanted to tell me their stories, and that was both great and bad. It was great because it was fascinating. It was bad because it put me in a complicated position of they knew I was taking notes and I was interested, but it was also I don't want to use this, even if it's a novel, even if it's fictionalized, I don't want to use it in a way that's too recognizable. So I tried to kind of glean some essential truths of the stories they told me, but then scramble things in order to protect people's feelings and privacy. But the truth is, I've stayed in touch with several of my coworkers. I've given them the book, and I have not heard back from any of them, so I'm getting a little worried. And at this point, I'm like, I gotta call them, because I've been waiting for them to call me, but maybe they haven't called me because they haven't read the book and they feel guilty, and I'm like, oh, they read the book and they hate it. So soon I should be able to report back what they think.
Is there a hand raised on this side? Okay.
So I should preface that I haven't read the book yet. So what prompted you, this sort of change in direction for you was, at least in part, the 2016 election. And that makes me wonder how much of the political leanings and beliefs of your characters did you put in the book, and how did you decide how much to put in?
So I wound up putting very, very little. I mean, actually, I should say none. And I guess it was as much as I had been intellectually impacted in some way by the election, I didn't want to make the book about my politics. I did want to explore their situation and try to explore it accurately and fairly, and not make it about advancing my own politics. So I just tried to be sparing, so sparing that I think at one point it's referred to that one of the characters used to work for a hotel owned by the person who was at that point president, but the name of that president is nowhere in the book. I felt like it would be too sort of topical to do actual political arguments about like the way in which I want to. I think the book does something political, but it's more on the level of economic inequality, and it doesn't presume, what someone's party preference is. And I thought that was very interesting, actually getting to know my coworkers. That there were several who were very into, say, conservative talk radio and would repeat talking points from conservative during the time I was working in the store. I remember that there's a time when that story was very big about, was John McCain really a war hero even though he'd been captured? So there'd be like political arguments would break out between people who were into the conservative talk radio and people who weren't. Sometimes, and that would happen in the break room. But I have to say, for most of my coworkers were non-voters and not particularly engaged. And for me, that was very eye-opening because I came to have a lot of sympathy with why they were non-voters. And I think they had seen their own jobs and their own quality of life deteriorate so much, no matter what party was in power. They'd watched like the lives that their parents and grandparents had just kind of slip away as full-time jobs became scarce, jobs with benefits became scarce. And I think they were understandably cynical about both parties. And I guess to me, that's what I want to capture. I came away with much more sympathy for their cynicism than I went in with. And I thought that was more interesting than sort of the differences between, the actual political arguments we tend to have about who to vote for or who not to.
What an exciting glimpse into how a novel came to be. And it sounds like a caper to write the novel, every bit as exciting as the novel itself. Please give a thunderous round of applause for Adelle Waldman.
Thank you.